In a modest house nestled on the outskirts of Atlanta, where magnolia trees cast dappled shadows over quiet streets, Sincere and Amya first laid eyes on their newborn son. The boy, born through the meticulous process of in vitro fertilization, was delicate, his tiny fingers grasping at the air as if reaching for something unseen. His large, dark eyes held an unsettling awareness, as though he understood the world beyond his infant comprehension. Amia cradled him in her arms, her hands trembling slightly under the weight of conflicting emotions. Joy surged within her, a bright, fleeting warmth at the sight of this new life, but it was tangled with a deep, aching sorrow that had lingered for 3 years. The loss of their firstborn, Caleb, in a devastating car accident, had left a wound that time had not healed. The tragedy had shattered their world, leaving behind a hollow silence that seemed to echo in every corner of their home. Sincere stood beside her, his presence steady but subdued, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. His touch was meant to comfort, but his eyes betrayed the same grief that haunted Amia, a shared pain that neither could fully articulate. The hospital room was bathed in soft, sterile light, the hum of medical equipment a faint backdrop to the moment. Amia studied the baby's face, noting the curve of his cheeks, the faint crease of his brow, and the way his lips pursed as he drifted into sleep. She had longed for this moment, for the chance to hold a child again, to rebuild what had been taken from them. Yet, as she gazed at him, a flicker of unease stirred within her. There was something in the boy's expression, a fleeting shadow that reminded her of Caleb, not in the obvious features, but in the quiet intensity of his gaze. She pushed the thought away, attributing it to exhaustion and the rawness of her emotions. The nurses had been kind, their voices gentle as they guided the couple through the final steps of bringing their son home. They named him Ethan, a name chosen with care, one that felt fresh and unburdened by the past. It was a deliberate act, a quiet vow to start anew, to let this child carve his own place in their lives. The drive back to their home was quiet, the city's skyline fading into the rearview mirror as they wound through suburban streets. Sincere kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the wheel, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He remembered the days after Caleb's death, the way the house had felt too large, too empty, the silence oppressive. The decision to pursue IVF had been fraught, a delicate balance of hope and fear, but it had given them something to hold on to. Now, with Ethan in the back seat, nestled in his car seat, Sincere felt a cautious optimism, tempered by the weight of memory. The house they returned to was the same one where Caleb had taken his first steps, where his laughter had once filled the air. Photos of him still lined the walls, though Amia had moved some to the attic in an attempt to make room for new memories. The nursery, freshly painted in soft blues, awaited Ethan, its crib adorned with a mobile of tiny stars that spun lazily in the breeze from an open window. As they settled into the rhythm of caring for a newborn, the days blurred into a haze of feedings, sleepless nights, and small, fleeting moments of wonder. Amia spent hours watching Ethan, memorizing the way his chest rose and fell, the soft coos he made in his sleep. Yet with each passing day, the unease she had felt in the hospital grew harder to dismiss. There were moments when Ethan's eyes met hers, and she saw something that made her breath catch, a fleeting expression that mirrored Caleb's, a tilt of the head or a curious glance that felt like an echo. She told herself it was her mind playing tricks, that grief had a way of weaving illusions. Sincere noticed it too, though he said nothing at first. He watched Ethan's tiny hands curl around a rattle, the same way Caleb's had, and felt a pang of recognition. The couple avoided speaking of it, as if acknowledging the similarities would give them power, would make the past too real again. They focused instead on the practicalities of parenthood, diapers, bottles, the soft hum of a lullaby Amia sang to soothe Ethan to sleep. The neighborhood around them buzzed with the quiet rhythm of suburban life. Children rode bikes down the street, their laughter carrying through open windows. The magnolias bloomed vibrantly, their petals scattering across lawns like confetti. Sincere and Amia's home stood apart, its curtains often drawn, as if shielding its occupants from the world outside. Friends and neighbours stopped by with gifts and well wishes, their voices bright with congratulations, but the couple's smiles were restrained, their gratitude tempered by an unspoken weight. Ethan was a healthy baby, the doctors assured them, his growth on track, his milestones met with clockwork precision. Yet as Amia rocked him in the nursery one evening, the light from a street lamp casting long shadows across the room, she felt a shiver run through her. Ethan's gaze locked onto hers, and for a moment it was as if Caleb looked back, a fleeting, impossible moment that left her heart racing. She held him closer, whispering his name, Ethan, as if to anchor herself in the present, to remind herself that this was her son, not a ghost. But the shadow of the past lingered, a quiet presence that neither she nor Sincere could fully escape. Ethan grew quickly, his small frame filling out as months turned into years in the quiet house on the edge of Atlanta. By the time he reached 2, the subtle similarities that had once flickered in his infant gaze began to take sharper form, stirring unease in Sincere and Amia that neither could fully dismiss. The nursery, once a sanctuary of new beginnings, became a stage for moments that felt like echoes of a life lost. Ethan discovered a box of puzzles tucked away in a corner of the living room, their pieces faded from use, but familiar to Sincere and Amia. They had belonged to Caleb, who spent hours arranging them with a quiet intensity, his head tilted slightly to the left as he worked. Ethan approached the puzzles with the same focus, his small hands moving with a precision that seemed too practiced for his age. He sat cross-legged on the floor, his brow furrowed, tilting his head in that same peculiar way, as if guided by an unseen memory. Amia watched from the doorway, her breath catching as she tried to convince herself it was merely a coincidence, a quirk of childhood that meant nothing. Sincere, too, began to notice patterns that unsettled him. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes in the attic to make space for Ethan's growing collection of toys, he found a small, red toy car buried beneath a pile of forgotten belongings. It was Caleb's favourite, a battered die-cast vehicle he had carried everywhere, its paint chipped from years of play. Sincere had tucked it away after the accident, unable to look at it without feeling the weight of loss. Yet, when he brought the box downstairs, Ethan's eyes locked onto the car with an almost instinctive recognition. He reached for it, his fingers curling around it as if it had always been his, and began rolling it across the floor with the same absent-minded hum Caleb used to make. Sincere stood frozen, his heart pounding as he watched his son play, the scene so achingly familiar it felt like a wound reopening. He told himself it was just a toy, that children were drawn to such things, but the explanation felt hollow. As Ethan began to speak, his words brought new moments of disquiet. The neighbour's dog, a scruffy terrier that roamed the street, had always been a fixture in their lives. Caleb had named it Buddy years ago, a name that stuck even after he was gone. Ethan, barely able to string sentences together, pointed at the dog one morning as it trotted past their fence and declared, "Buddy." Amia, standing at the kitchen sink, froze, the dish in her hand slipping back into the soapy water. She turned to look at Ethan, who was oblivious to the weight of his words, his attention already drifting to a butterfly fluttering nearby. She tried to laugh it off, telling herself it was a common name, one she might have mentioned in passing, but the chill that ran down her spine lingered. She avoided Sincere's gaze that evening, afraid he would see the doubt in her eyes, the creeping fear that something inexplicable was unfolding. The small details began to pile up, each one a thread tying Ethan to a past he shouldn't know. At night, as Amia tucked him into bed, Ethan would curl up with one hand tucked under his cheek, his breathing soft and even. It was the same way Caleb had slept, a habit so distinctive that Amia had once teased him about it, calling it his thinking pose. Now seeing Ethan mirror it, she felt a pang of recognition that was both comforting and terrifying. Sincere noticed other habits too. Ethan's laugh, a bright, unrestrained sound that tilted his head back slightly, was eerily similar to Caleb's. He found himself watching Ethan more closely, searching for differences as much as similarities, desperate to convince himself that his son was his own person. Yet, the more he observed, the more the resemblances stood out, like pieces of a puzzle he didn't want to complete. The house, once a place of cautious hope, grew heavy with an unspoken tension. Amia and Sincere moved through their routines, cooking meals, tending to Ethan's needs, maintaining the neat lawn under the watchful eyes of neighbours, but a quiet unease settled between them. They avoided discussing the similarities, as if speaking them aloud would make them undeniable. Amia busied herself with Ethan's care, filling the days with play dates and trips to the park, hoping activity would drown out her doubts. Sincere threw himself into work, staying late at the office, but the image of Ethan clutching that red toy car followed him, a persistent reminder of the past. The neighborhood continued its rhythm, children playing, dogs barking, the hum of lawnmowers on weekends. But inside their home, a strange silence took root. It was a silence woven from hope and fear, from the longing to embrace Ethan fully, and the dread that he might be something more or less than their son. Each new coincidence deepened the mystery, leaving Sincere and Amia to grapple with a truth they weren't ready to face. By the time Ethan turned 3, the similarities that had once seemed like fleeting coincidences had woven themselves into a pattern too precise to ignore, casting a shadow over the quiet Atlanta home. Ethan no longer merely resembled Caleb in fleeting moments. His actions felt like a mirror reflecting a life that had ended too soon. One evening, as the golden light of dusk filtered through the living room windows, Amia sat on the couch with Ethan nestled against her, a worn storybook open on her lap. The tale was one of Caleb's favourites, its pages dog-eared from years of use. Ethan listened intently, his small body still, his eyes fixed on the illustrations. As Amia turned a page, Ethan's hand shot out, pointing to an old photograph on the mantelpiece. The image showed Caleb, his face lit with a wide grin, standing in front of a brightly painted carousel at a local park. Ethan's finger lingered on the frame. And with a clarity that sent a shiver through Amia, he said, "That's me." The words hung in the air, simple yet impossibly heavy. Amia's hands froze on the book, her heart racing as she stared at her son, who seemed oblivious to the weight of what he had just said. The photograph had been there for years, untouched, a quiet memorial to a lost child, but Ethan's recognition of it felt like a crack in the fabric of reality. Sincere, who had been in the kitchen rinsing dishes, paused at the sound of Ethan's voice. He stepped into the living room, drying his hands on a towel, his gaze shifting from Ethan to the photograph. Amia's eyes met his, wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief, but neither spoke. The moment passed, and Ethan returned to the story, his small fingers tracing the edges of the book's pages. Yet the incident lingered, a splinter in their thoughts. Sincere began to question everything, his mind replaying the small line, uncanny details that had accumulated over the years. He noticed how Ethan's gestures, his way of twirling a spoon while eating, his habit of kicking off one shoe before the other, mirrored Caleb so closely it felt deliberate. These were not just habits. They were fragments of a life that should have been impossible for Ethan to know. Sincere's unease grew, a quiet suspicion that gnawed at him during the long hours he spent awake at night, staring at the ceiling while Amia slept fitfully beside him. Determined to find answers, Sincere turned his attention to the past. He retrieved a box of documents from the attic, papers from the fertility clinic where Ethan had been conceived through IVF. The contracts signed in the haze of grief and hope 3 years earlier were dense with medical jargon and fine print. Sincere sat at the kitchen table late into the night, his reading glasses perched on his nose, poring over the pages. He scrutinized every clause, every signature, searching for something, anything that might explain the impossible similarities. The clinic had been reputable, its reputation built on cutting-edge technology and compassionate care, but Sincere's trust in it wavered. He began to wonder if they had overlooked something in their desperation to have another child, some detail buried in the paperwork that held the key to Ethan's unsettling resemblance to Caleb. His suspicions spread like ink on fabric, darkening his thoughts with each passing day. Ethan's behaviours grew more striking, each one a thread pulling Sincere and Amia deeper into uncertainty. One afternoon, while Amia hummed a lullaby in the kitchen, a melody she had sung only to Caleb, soft and lilting, never shared with anyone else, Ethan began to hum along, his small voice matching the tune perfectly. Amia stopped, her hands trembling as she gripped the counter, her eyes fixed on her son, who continued humming as he stacked blocks on the floor. The melody was not one played on the radio or taught in daycare. It was hers, a private song born in the quiet moments of Caleb's infancy. Later that week, Ethan wandered into the backyard, his small feet padding across the grass to a corner of the garden where Caleb had once buried a toy airplane, a bright blue plastic plane he had loved. Ethan knelt down, his hands digging into the soil with purpose, as if he knew exactly where to look. Amia watched from the porch, her heart pounding as he unearthed a small, dirt-caked object, too weathered to identify, but unmistakably familiar. She called Sincere outside, her voice tight with panic, and together they stared at the spot where Ethan played. The ground disturbed as if Caleb himself had returned to reclaim his treasure. Sincere's anger simmered, a slow burn fueled by disbelief and betrayal. He felt violated, as if something sacred had been tampered with, though he couldn't yet name what it was. The idea that Ethan's similarities to Caleb were not random but orchestrated began to take root. He spent hours online, researching the clinic, its practices, and the science of IVF, looking for any hint of irregularity. He found nothing concrete, but the absence of answers only deepened his resolve. Amia, meanwhile, withdrew into herself, her days spent watching Ethan with a mixture of love and dread. She wanted to hold him close, to protect him from the questions that swirled around them, but each familiar gesture, each echo of Caleb, made her question who he truly was. The house, once a place of cautious healing, became a space where every moment felt like a test, a challenge to separate the present from the past. Sincere and Amia moved through their days with a growing sense of unease, their love for Ethan undeniable, but shadowed by a suspicion that something unnatural had brought him into their lives. Sincere had reached a breaking point, the weight of unanswered questions pressing too heavily to ignore any longer. He contacted a private investigator, a discreet professional recommended by a colleague, to delve into the operations of the fertility clinic that had facilitated Ethan's birth. The decision came after sleepless nights spent wrestling with the growing certainty that Ethan's uncanny resemblance to Caleb was no mere coincidence. The investigator, a meticulous man with a reputation for uncovering hidden truths, took the case with a quiet nod, promising to leave no stone unturned. Sincere provided him with every detail he could recall: dates, names, the clinic's glossy brochures filled with promises of hope, and waited, his days consumed by a restless anticipation. Weeks passed, each one stretching longer than the last, as Sincere went through the motions of daily life, his interactions with Ethan and Amia, tinged with a guarded distance. He watched his son play in the backyard, kicking a ball with the same lopsided grin Caleb once had, and felt a knot tighten in his chest, a mix of love and suspicion that left him hollow. The investigators' findings arrived on a grey, humid afternoon, delivered in a plain manila envelope that Sincere opened at the kitchen table, while Ethan napped upstairs. The documents inside were clinical, filled with technical terms and timelines, but their implications were devastating. The clinic, renowned for its cutting-edge reproductive technologies, had stored frozen DNA samples from Caleb, collected after his death under the guise of routine medical research. The samples were meant to remain archived, a standard procedure for genetic studies. But one doctor, a senior embryologist with a reputation for pushing ethical boundaries, had taken a different path. Moved by what he believed was compassion, he had used Caleb's DNA to create an embryo for Sincere and Amia, bypassing standard protocols and without their consent. The doctor's notes, included in the investigator's report, described his intention to ease the couple's grief by giving them a chance to reclaim their lost son. The revelation hit Sincere like a physical blow, his hands shaking as he read the evidence of this unauthorized act. Ethan, the boy they had raised and loved, was a biological replica of Caleb, crafted in a lab to mirror the child they had buried. Sincere drove home from the investigator's office in a daze, the envelope clutched tightly in his hand. The Atlanta skyline blurred past, its familiar contours distorted by the storm brewing in his mind. He felt betrayed, not just by the clinic, but by the very foundation of his family's new beginning. The house was quiet when he entered. The late afternoon light casting long shadows across the living room. Amia was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner, her movements mechanical. Ethan played nearby, stacking wooden blocks into a wobbly tower, his small face lit with concentration. Sincere placed the envelope on the counter, its presence a silent accusation. Amia's eyes flicked to it, then to Sincere, and she set the knife down, her hands unsteady. Without a word, she opened the envelope and began reading, her breath growing shallow as the truth unfolded. The documents detailed the process, the extraction of Caleb's DNA, the creation of the embryo, the deliberate choice to implant it in Amia, all done in secret, a violation masked as kindness. Her hands trembled as she turned the pages, her face pale, her eyes fixed on the words that redefined their son. Amia sank into a chair, the papers slipping from her fingers to the table. She stared at Ethan, who was now humming softly to himself, oblivious to the upheaval unfolding around him. The boy's features, once a source of quiet wonder, now seemed like a cruel illusion, each curve of his face a reminder of Caleb. She tried to reconcile the child she loved with the truth she now held, but her mind reeled, caught between maternal instinct and the sting of betrayal. Sincere stood by the window, his back to her, his shoulders rigid with suppressed anger. He couldn't bring himself to look at Ethan, not yet. Not with the knowledge that his son was a creation born of someone else's decision. The room felt smaller, the air thick with unspoken questions. Was Ethan truly their son, or was he a shadow of Caleb, engineered to fill a void they hadn't asked to fill? The laughter that spilled from Ethan as his block tower collapsed felt distant, almost alien. A sound that once brought joy now tinged with an unsettling strangeness. The evening stretched on, the house enveloped in a heavy silence. Amia moved through the motions of bedtime, tucking Ethan into his bed, her hands lingering on his blanket as she watched him drift to sleep. His small chest rose and fell, his face peaceful, but she couldn't shake the image of Caleb superimposed over him. Sincere sat alone in the living room, the investigator's report open before him, its pages a map of a truth he hadn't wanted to find. The clinic's actions had shattered the fragile trust they had placed in it, leaving them to grapple with a reality where their son's existence was both a miracle and a manipulation. The familiar sounds of the house, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, felt hollow, unable to fill the void left by the revelation. As night fell, the couple remained apart, each lost in their own thoughts, the weight of the truth pressing down on them, a fracture in their world that no amount of love could yet mend. The weeks that followed the revelation about Ethan's origins were a slow unraveling, a quiet erosion of the fragile equilibrium Sincere and Amia had tried to maintain in their Atlanta home. The truth, laid bare in the investigators' documents, had fractured something essential, leaving them to navigate a reality where love and betrayal were impossibly intertwined. Sincere found it increasingly difficult to look at Ethan without seeing Caleb's shadow superimposed over his son's face. Each glance brought a flood of memories. Caleb's lopsided grin, his quick footsteps echoing through the house, the way he'd cling to Sincere's leg during thunderstorms. Ethan's every gesture seemed to echo those moments, from the way he tilted his head when puzzled to the absent-minded way he twirled a spoon at breakfast. Sincere's heart ached with a love he couldn't fully trust, tainted by the knowledge that Ethan's existence was a manipulation. He blamed himself for not questioning the clinic sooner, for signing papers in a haze of grief without scrutinizing their implications. His anger turned outward too, directed at the faceless doctor who had played God with their lives, believing a replica could heal their wounds. Amia, by contrast, clung to Ethan with a fierce, almost desperate devotion, as if holding him tighter could anchor her in a world that felt increasingly adrift. She spent hours with him, reading stories, building block towers, guiding his small hands as he scribbled with crayons. Yet each familiar gesture, each time Ethan laughed in that same bright, head-tilted way Caleb had, pierced her with a fresh wave of pain. She caught herself watching him too closely, searching for Caleb in the curve of his smile, expecting the same quick wit or stubborn streak that had defined her first son. The comparisons were involuntary, a reflex she couldn't suppress, and they filled her with guilt. She knew it was unfair to measure Ethan against a ghost, to burden him with expectations he couldn't possibly understand. But the knowledge of his origins made it impossible to see him solely as himself. At night, she lay awake, her mind caught in a loop of questions. Was she loving Ethan for who he was, or for who he resembled? The uncertainty gnawed at her, a quiet torment that left her feeling like a stranger in her own home. The tension between Sincere and Amir grew, a silent rift that widened with each passing day. Sincere spent long hours researching legal options, his laptop glowing late into the night as he read about lawsuits against medical institutions, his jaw tight with determination. He wanted justice, not just for the violation of their trust, but for the way it had tainted their bond with Ethan. He imagined confronting the clinic, forcing them to admit their overreach, to acknowledge the pain they had caused. Amir, however, recoiled at the idea of a lawsuit. She feared the publicity, the scrutiny that would follow, and the way it might brand Ethan as something unnatural, a product of a lab rather than their son. She saw the anger in Sincere's eyes, the way he distanced himself from Ethan, and it terrified her. She worried that pursuing legal action would tear their family apart, leaving them with nothing but resentment and a child caught in the crossfire. Their disagreements, once rare, became frequent, their voices low but sharp, each argument a reflection of their shared pain and divergent ways of coping. Ethan, though too young to understand the undercurrents, sensed the shift in the household. His laughter, once a constant melody, grew quieter, his play more subdued. He no longer ran to Sincere with the same unbridled enthusiasm, as if he could feel the weight of his father's gaze. Amir noticed how he clung to her more, his small hands gripping her sleeve when she moved to leave the room. She tried to shield him from the tension, filling his days with games and outings, but her efforts felt hollow. The house, once a place of warmth, now carried a chill, its walls echoing with unspoken fears. The magnolia trees outside stood in full bloom, their petals carpeting the lawn, but inside the air felt stagnant, heavy with the weight of a truth neither parent could fully process. One night, Amir woke from a vivid nightmare, her heart pounding as she sat up in the darkness. In the dream, Caleb and Ethan stood side by side in the backyard, their faces identical, their eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her chest tighten. She reached out, desperate to touch them, but her hands passed through air, and she couldn't tell which was which. The dream left her shaken, her breath uneven as she slipped out of bed and stood by Ethan's door, watching him sleep. His small form was curled under the blanket, one hand tucked under his cheek, just as Caleb's had been. The sight brought tears to her eyes, not just for the loss of Caleb, but for the realization that she was failing Ethan by seeing him as a shadow of his brother. By morning, as she prepared breakfast with mechanical precision, Amir understood that she could no longer live in this liminal space, caught between two children, one living and one gone. The fracture in their family was deepening, and she feared it would consume them all if they didn't find a way to move forward. Amir sat in the garden, her knees drawn up on a weathered wooden bench, her eyes fixed on Ethan as he knelt in the soft earth, his small hands scooping sand into a shallow pile. The late afternoon sun filtered through the magnolia trees, casting a warm glow over the backyard of their Atlanta home, the air heavy with the scent of blooming flowers and damp soil. Ethan's fingers moved with purpose, digging a small hollow in the exact spot where Caleb, years ago, had spent hours shaping castles and trenches, his laughter mingling with the rustle of leaves. The memory surged unbidden, and tears welled in Amir's eyes, spilling down her cheeks without resistance. For so long, she had fought these moments, pushing away the pain of seeing Caleb in Ethan's every gesture, but now she let the tears fall, a quiet surrender to the truth she had been avoiding. Ethan was not Caleb, despite the haunting similarities that had unraveled their lives. He was a child of his own with a future unwritten, dreams that were his alone. To love him, she realized she had to stop searching for the ghost of her first son in his face, his movements, his laughter. Sincere emerged from the house, his footsteps slow as he crossed the lawn, his face etched with exhaustion but softened by a new, tentative calm. He had spent weeks wrestling with anger and betrayal, his nights consumed by thoughts of legal battles and retribution against the clinic that had engineered Ethan's existence. But the fire of his resolve had begun to fade, replaced by a weary acceptance that no lawsuit could undo the past or restore what they had lost. He sat beside Amir on the bench, his presence a quiet anchor, and for the first time in months, they shared the silence without tension. Their hands rested close but not touching, the space between them a testament to the distance they had endured and the fragile bridge they were beginning to rebuild. As Ethan played, oblivious to their gaze, they began to speak, their words halting at first, then flowing freely. They shared their fears of losing Ethan to the shadow of Caleb, of failing to love him as himself, and their hopes for a future where their family could heal, where Ethan could grow unburdened by the weight of a past he didn't choose. The conversation stretched into the evening, the sky deepening to a soft indigo as fireflies began to flicker in the garden. Sincere admitted his struggle to see Ethan as more than a replica, his guilt for the moments he had pulled away, unable to reconcile the boy with the truth of his origins. Amia confessed her own pain, the way she had caught herself expecting Ethan to mirror Caleb's quirks, as if he were a continuation rather than a new beginning. They spoke of the clinic's betrayal, the violation of their trust, but also of the futility of seeking justice through courts. A lawsuit might expose the truth, but it would not bring Caleb back, nor would it change the fact that Ethan was their son, woven into their lives with a love that, despite everything, remained unshaken. They agreed to let go of the legal battle, choosing instead to focus on the child before them, to build a life where the past was a memory, not a chain. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Amia rose from the bench and approached Ethan, who looked up from his sandpile, his face smudged with dirt and lit with a shy smile. She knelt beside him, her hands gentle as she brushed the sand from his fingers and then lifted him into her arms. For the first time in what felt like years, she held him without the weight of Caleb's shadow, feeling only the warmth of Ethan's small body, the steady rhythm of his breath against her shoulder. His eyes, so like Caleb's yet uniquely his own, met hers, and she felt a clarity she had long denied herself. This was Ethan, her son, not a replacement or a ghost, but a boy with his own path, his own light. Sincere watched from the bench, his heart easing as he saw the change in Amia's posture, the way she held Ethan with a tenderness untainted by grief. As twilight settled over the garden, Sincere joined them, carrying a small sapling they had bought weeks earlier but never planted, its roots wrapped in burlap. Together they chose a spot near the edge of the yard, away from the sandbox where Caleb's memories lingered. Sincere dug a hole, his hands steady in the cool earth, while Amia held Ethan, guiding his small hands to pat the soil around the sapling's base. The act was simple, deliberate, a symbol of their commitment to a new chapter, one where Ethan could grow without the burden of comparison. The tree stood small but sturdy, its leaves catching the last light of the day, a quiet promise of growth and renewal. As they stepped back to admire their work, the garden seemed to breathe again, the air lighter, the silence no longer heavy with unspoken pain. The past would always be there, a part of their story, but it no longer held them captive. Ethan, still clutching a handful of dirt, giggled softly, and for the first time, Sincere and Amia heard only his laughter, a sound that belonged to the present, to a future they could finally embrace.